Okay, so let me just quickly introduce Dr. Rubino. So this is Elena. She's an assistant professor of conservation social science at the University of Arkansas at Monticello, and she specializes in decision making on private lands and conservation communications. And she's going to be giving a presentation and kind of an open discussion platform on perceptions of CWD, mostly focusing in the Southeast and what it means for parties of interest and agencies. So now I will pass that over to you, Dr. Rubino, for you to begin the presentation.
Cool, thank you. So thanks all for joining me tonight, taking time out of your day for that. Like Genevieve kind of mentioned, so I have plenty of slides ready to go, but these things are always more fun for me and probably more fun for you if they're kind of more discussion-ish based. So anytime you have a question, just like chime in or drop it in the chat and I'll make sure that that's up so that I'm kind of monitoring that as well. But yeah, any kind of thoughts you have, questions, comments, anything like that, it's just fun when we kind of chat about this stuff. So yeah, today I just wanted to talk a little bit about chronic wasting disease, CWD. It's something that I've been kind of studying now for, I guess, 3 years-ish in different contexts. And today, a lot of what I'm talking about, at least the slides that I'll be kind of going through in terms of my research, is based on some work in Texas that I did. But I've also, since moving to Arkansas, been involved in studying CWD perceptions in Arkansas as well. So before kind of jumping, oh, I have chat stuff going on. Let me make sure that that's up for me. Cool. Okay. Great. So just kind of a little bit about what I do. Genevieve mentioned that I'm a conservation social scientist, which I know for most people, including a lot of my colleagues, doesn't kind of really mean much. So I like to kind of start everything that I do with kind of orienting where we are with regards to kind of the research that I do and my field, basically. So this is just kind of a look at the social sciences as we know them. You can see over here, you have kind of your classic social sciences. I tend to think of these as almost like college majors, right? You can major in economics or poli-sci or sociology or anthro, something like that. And then we get more into kind of applied social sciences like education, communication, and then arts and humanities is towards the bottom. And that's kind of out of my realm of study. So anything social science related. And the idea here is basically that I just kind of take methods and theories from these disciplines and apply them to, there we go, to conservation. In my case, a lot of what I do is decision making. But I also cover a whole bunch of other kinds of areas in here, different social processes, phenomenon, and individual attributes. And a lot of that stuff will be kind of featured in today's conversation. And here's just a look, so specifically conservation social science, right? Like, what does that really mean? So like I showed before, right, a psychologist tends to focus on like the inner psyche of someone's mind, or even kind of socially speaking, and they'll study different topics within that discipline. I have the cool job of taking a bunch of disciplines and focusing on one topic, in which case it's conservation or wildlife management kind of more generally. A lot of you have probably heard of the term, or at least might be familiar with the term, human dimensions of conservation. That's just one little slice of this larger pie. I think a lot of times people kind of use social science and human dimensions interchangeably, and social science is just the umbrella under which human dimensions can be found. And human dimensions tends to look really at kind of attitudes and perceptions. A lot of what I'll be talking about today is under that human dimensions kind of subsection, but there's a whole bunch of other areas that I personally kind of dabble in, and then there's plenty of others up here that, you know, are kind of out of what I do, but other conservation social scientists deal with those types of issues. And I also like to start, I do this for my classes, and again, just to kind of orient ourselves. This is from actually like one of the kind of wildlife management textbooks, where the rest of the book is all wildlife management related stuff, but kind of the core here is that when you're managing for wildlife, 90% of that is actually managing for people and 10% is managing for the wildlife itself. And that's something that I teach undergrads and grad students, but my undergrads, you know, if they come into these programs, oh, I'm so excited
Give me a second, let me see what's going on with your internet connection. I'll be right back.
To study deer or manage duck pop, just kind of do a quick overview on chronic wasting disease, or CWD, as I'll be saying a whole bunch. Internet connection unstable, great. CWD is essentially a prion-caused neurological disease. It impacts cervid species, so deer, elk, moose, species like that. As you can see, it's found kind of all over the US at this point. It is a fatal disease, so as soon as, well, not as soon, but when a deer gets it, it will eventually die from CWD. However, they'll find kind of physical symptoms that can be, as I'll show in a slide, the next slide. Sometimes they get like kind of growths on them. Sometimes basically they just kind of waste away, chronic wasting disease. And then there's also behavioral symptoms, where essentially the prion is eating at their brain. It's kind of like a mad cow disease, but for deer and cervid species. And so they'll behave very irregularly. There have been videos of them kind of just walking in circles, like these tight little circles. And that's kind of that brain decay at that point. Currently found in 29 states and 3 provinces, and that's free-ranging deer, the FRD. And that's actually just increased recently, because in a lot of stuff that I was publishing last year, it was 26 states. So already we're seeing increases, and that's just kind of the trend that is very frequent at this point. And then it's also found in 18 states and 3 provinces in their captive deer population. And I'll be talking a little bit more about captive deer later on this evening. And here's an image of, I tried to keep it not overly graphic, but kind of you can see that wasting away of the body at that point. So they get very, very emaciated, eventually leading to death there. So why do we care? And specifically related to CWD, but also people's perceptions of CWD, which is what I study, right? I'm not really on that ecological or kind of disease ecology side of things. I'm on the social science side. So why does that even matter? Obviously, this is a major wildlife health issue. And kind of one of the reasons that agencies are worried about this is there's a pretty real potential for population declines if the spread of this disease kind of spreads through enough of the population in an area. So you can imagine that leading definitely to management implications for agencies in terms of managing the disease and managing populations to make sure that those CWD rates and prevalence levels are kept low. And in terms of those perceptions of stakeholders and rights holder groups, so a lot of times we're talking hunters and landowners when we're talking CWD kind of stakeholders, we're interested in the behavior, right? And that can be changes in hunting behavior. For example, license sales is a big one that agencies are always interested in. Kind of some initial literature that I'll talk about notes how there were concerns that license sales would drop when CWD kind of first comes into an area, and also related to harvesting and management patterns. So a lot of deer and wildlife management is based on kind of voluntary management through hunters. So if those hunting populations decline, we could potentially have an issue in terms of the management side of things as well. And then on the landowner side of things, making sure kind of a big sticking point for agencies is making sure that there's cooperation between landowners and agencies, because if you need to manage populations on private lands, which at least here in the South, in Arkansas, it's something like 92 or 93% of land is privately owned. You can imagine making sure that there's a relationship between private landowners and agencies. That needs to be there in order to make sure that those populations get managed when they're on private lands, in addition to the public lands that state agencies are already covering. So I kind of wanted to start off with an overview of CWD perceptions research. This goes back 20 years at this point, a lot of this stuff. Kind of the first main papers on it, yeah, probably like 2004-ish, 2003. So I just kind of wanted to cover some of that before diving into my own research, more recently in Texas and Arkansas. A lot of the initial research kind of occurred more north and west. And then it's basically as the disease has kind of spread, we see other states starting to generate some more research as well. So a lot of this research really started in terms of beliefs and knowledge of CWD. And there were also aspects of agency trust. And that's something that I'll touch on in some of my slides a little bit later. But again, just that idea that agencies and the stakeholders involved, whether it's hunters or landowners, there needs to be at least some level of trust and that idea of kind of cooperation between those agencies. Because when you have, especially kind of an emerging threat, which initial CWD, when people barely kind of understood what it was or what it meant for deer populations, knowing that the agency had things generally under control, or at least could be a trustworthy source of information, was super important. And even now, in terms of those management implications, that trust is still a really important factor. And so that's pretty consistently a part of any sort of survey that agencies are conducting when they're sending out surveys to the hunting public related to CWD. Typically, it's good news. It's been found to be generally positive. So generally strong positive feelings of agency trust from stakeholders towards the agencies. And again, this can kind of be linked back to ideas of management alternatives and how agencies should be managing when there's that idea of trust and that concept of trust that's going through there. Hunters and agencies can kind of be on the same page in terms of making sure that those populations are managed appropriately. There's also a big component of this research that's related to risk perceptions and concern for human health. And that's kind of interesting. It's still something that we kind of ask about, but at this point, just to kind of be clear, there are no known kind of human health implications at this point. But it's something that we kind of continue to ask about and kind of keep on our radar, particularly because agency communications, the general kind of communication point that most agencies make is that you shouldn't eat meat that was harvested from a CWD positive deer. And that's why testing can be so important in terms of making sure what you can and can't eat. But that said, so there's kind of a little bit of conflict between those ideas that people have pointed out. But generally, the good news is that we have seen kind of limited concern for human health in a lot of these surveys, just with the recognition that so far nothing has really happened in terms of that human health and CWD kind of crossover. But we're still seeing that wariness of eating meat, which again aligns with agency recommendations. So that's great. But interestingly, there hasn't been a whole lot of behavior change to back it up. So by that, I kind of mean people will say, oh yeah, I'm concerned about eating CWD positive meat. But when you ask about whether they get their meat tested, sometimes, that answer can be no. And so then you're not seeing that lineup. Well, if you were actually concerned, you'd probably go get that tested. So we see a little bit of conflict in results of a lot of research that indicates, people are concerned about it, but not really enough to change their behavior, which is very common in human behavior change research related to CWD or otherwise. And related to risk perceptions, there's also that idea of risk perceptions and concerns for deer population health. So rather than humans, looking at deer populations. And here, this is where we see people being concerned about that, rightfully so. There's plenty of evidence that indicates that CWD can lead to declines in populations and just that fatality, just generally speaking. So that is definitely a concern that we're seeing and that is had among various stakeholder groups. But again, we're not seeing a whole lot of major long-term behavior change. And I kind of specify that because there is some research to indicate that initially when CWD is kind of found in an area, there might be little ticks in changes in human behavior. For example, initially, sometimes there are license declines, license sale declines and things like that. But as people get more familiar with just the disease being in that area, that'll pick back up and human behavior change continues to stay the same or at least level out to basically where it was prior to CWD being found in that area. And so again, thinking about those hunter behavior changes, we can see larger behavioral intent changes when CWD events are spatially and temporally near or close. So the hunters usually that are closest to CWD outbreaks, that's where we tend to see people saying, oh yeah, I'm definitely going to change my behavior. And that the same goes for when those when CWD is initially found in an area. A lot of people say, oh yeah, I'm definitely going to stop hunting in this area, or I'm not going to buy a license anymore. Big changes in terms of that behavioral intent, but then thinking about that long term, that stuff levels back out. And so we don't really, so far agencies have not been that greatly impacted over the long term with regards to CWD in most states. And then finally, thinking about these preferred management alternatives, largely speaking, most stakeholders and rights holders are against the do nothing approach. So there's a recognition that CWD is a bad thing, and we want to manage populations for that disease. We don't want the agency to just kind of sit on their hands and let it take its course, which is good news. Typically, alternatives that are kind of positively associated with are things like testing. So people can generally get on board with having your deer tested, specifically if they're in kind of a high CWD prevalence zone, or at least a zone that they know CWD is present. And usually that testing is free. So that kind of helps people get on board. There's some research that indicates that as soon as testing isn't free anymore, that support for that kind of alternative goes down. And usually hunter harvesting is a preferred management alternative. And that's kind of in comparison to sharpshooting, for example. If the idea is to really go in and reduce populations, sometimes hunter harvest isn't enough. So agencies have kind of brought up, well, if hunter harvest isn't enough, can we bring sharpshooters in to kind of artificially decrease these populations? And that's where things get a little dicier. Some populations in some surveys have said, yeah, we're fine with that. As long as hunters kind of get the first go at it, we're good with it. And other times it's like, nope, that's kind of beyond the scope of what we should be doing. If hunters aren't going to take care of it, you know, we need to figure out something else. So that was kind of general overview of CWD research, like 30 years of research summarized into like 5 minutes. Any questions, comments related to that? Just kind of want to open it up and take a pause here. And feel free to drop anything in the chat, have that open. Okay, cool. Then we will forge on. I wanted to talk a little bit about some of my Texas case study work. Again, this is from my time in Texas. This survey went out starting in 2020, which was challenging to get responses, admittedly, during kind of peak knowledge. So quick question in the chat. I don't know if everyone can see this or not, but what's your knowledge on the connection of biosolids? I don't know anything about that. Can you, Elizabeth, kind of, I guess, and I may be the only one who doesn't know what that is, but can you expand on that a little bit? Okay, take your time.
There we go. Can you hear me?
Yes, awesome.
Perfect. Yeah, I do a lot of researching, and I'm new to the Artemis organization, but I looked some of this up beforehand, and there seems to be a potential connection between biosolids and prions. And I don't know if you're aware of this, but they're spreading biosolids all over farmlands, and they're using it as a fertilizer. And the EPA is very aware of it. And when you read some of the articles, it's kind of like, you know, EPA is telling you it's safe, but on the other hand, they're telling you it's not safe. And I've also read some things where you can actually inhale, it can be inhaled in the air. So I think people are right to be concerned if they're hunting for deer meat, elk meat, you should get it tested. The prions, from what I understand, there's no way to destroy them. Mm-hmm. So heat doesn't kill them, nothing, none of the sterilization processes, which is why it makes absolutely no sense to be spreading that stuff onto farmland or crops. So that's why I was asking that question, if you were aware of the correlation. And are you familiar with a guy by the name of Chris, oh, what is his name? I think it's Chris Monk. He's out of Midlothian, Texas.
I don't.
Does that name sound familiar? Or no, I think it's Craig. It's Craig Monk. That's what it is.
Craig.
Yeah.
I don't think so.
He's done a lot of research on this because they're having some serious problems in their neighborhoods because it's so toxic, all the sludge, that people are getting sick. And of course, then it affects your property value, et cetera, et cetera. Sure. So that would be, I can send you some links of some articles that I've looked at that that talk about the tie-in, but I mean, I guess one of the questions I would want to ask, or I would look into, is where's the waste product coming? I know it goes from the East Coast out to the West. So when you know where it's being distributed, and when I looked at that map with all the colored dots that you had of where it's blowing up, that's farmland. So I'm wondering if there's a correlation there that we can look into, because it will spread. And it's also my understanding that it can spread through birds. I mean, it can travel in water. I mean, it's indestructible. So I can see how migration of the animals, that, you know, that can continue the spread further west.
Yeah, and that's a great point. I was fortunate enough, actually one of my classes that I teach over the summer, I stopped by a plantation that does, it's a very kind of like quality deer management based plantation in Tennessee. And there was like a CWD kind of expert there. And again, I am on the social science side. So a lot of the kind of ecological and, you know, zoonotic disease side is way beyond my purview. So I pick it up as I go, but it's not what I study. But he did mention, he was like, yeah, we're really struggling with the fact that you can't get rid of, once the prion is there, like it's pretty much there. I think he said it stays in the soil like upwards 10, 20 years or something. And yeah, fire doesn't kill it. Like once it's there, it's there. So once CWD is there and a deer drops dead, it's in the soil, another deer, come over and something else can pick it up. So yeah, it's, and that's what I think is so scary to people. And I think that this biosolid aspect it sounds very concerning. From the aspect of that, easily being picked up by something and just walking it, you know, the next state over.
You know, if everybody's interested, there's a movie, it's free. You just give them your email address. You can sign up. It's put out by Natural News. Mike Adams, who's a food forensic scientist, and it's called biosludge.com. And it's definitely worth watching. It's about an hour, but you can kind of get an idea in that. And Craig Monk is on there. You can see who he is. Gosh, I was digging around one time and I thought for sure I came across his email somewhere, which I can send you if you want more information on him. I could try to find it, but he would probably be a really good source to talk to about the whole connection between biosolids and the disease. So,
well, and that's a great, just thinking from, and a lot of this research that I kind of focused on is looking at hunter perceptions, because that tended to be where it started, and now we're getting more into recognizing that landowners are very much a group, kind of a party of interest involved in this. And certainly from that standpoint, I would imagine landowners would certainly have concerns over that.
Definitely.
Awesome. Cool. Thank you.
You bet.
April, you have your hand up.
Hi, sorry, I didn't want to interrupt before anything. I'm with the North Carolina Wildlife Resource Commission.
Awesome.
I'm currently a assistant fisheries biologist, but I have a master's in wildlife biology, and I've been interested in CWD for years. And whenever she mentioned biosolids, what I was actually thinking of was I was thinking about urine and, you know, their urine, feces, you know, the captive deer facilities, they can produce urine that is used as a scent lure. And for years, there's been the concern that you maybe should not be using natural urine, because if a captive facility were to get CWD, they wouldn't know in time that that deer was positive and it's now in the chain, and then you can move it around to other states just through urine. Though, you know, it might not be as much of a concern as you know, it's not as much concern as like deer to deer contact. But I guess I just wanted to really stress the whole just getting your deer tested is such an important thing. I've been getting my deer tested for years, and I've helped with collecting lymph nodes and such for testing. And getting deer tested is really important. We did not have cases in North Carolina that we knew about until last year.
Right.
And now it's within 30 some miles of where I personally hunt. And thankfully we got our deer tested, but somehow it popped up very far from the last case, which was in the western part of North Carolina. And getting deer tested is so important because we can figure out where next cases are. And also make sure you're being careful about gloves and don't prick yourself, clean it out. I've actually heard I read from some prion research, make a wound bleed, bleach it if you come in contact with prion disease. But get your deer tested and don't eat it if it's positive, because we don't know if it can be transmitted to people, but we thought mad cow couldn't be transmitted to people. So we don't want to take any chances. But we also, hunting is a great management tool. I'm still going to be out hunting, but I am careful and don't move around deer parts. Please follow regulations. But just wanted to mention some of that from the more of a zoonotic and more of the disease side of things.
No, that's fantastic. And yeah, thank you for bringing up both those aspects. I mean, testing obviously for your own personal safety, but also as a way to be able to track this disease. I mean, we can't, right? If just the people that where we know CWD are testing, like that's great. But if no one else is testing, we're never going to know if it actually, is traveling. So I completely echo that. And thank you for bringing that up. Fantastic. Any other kind of thoughts on anything? And thank you, Elizabeth, for dropping those links in there for anyone who wants to check those out. Cool. All right, awesome. And I'm glad that we have already kind of talked about some of the captive deer breeding stuff, because that's something that I actually didn't even appreciate was really a thing until I moved to Texas. And it's such a big part of the hunting industry there, but we'll get there when we get there. I won't get too ahead of myself. Oh, of course. No, thank you. And so, yeah, so just kind of to jump into at least this part of the Texas case study. And this is cool for me. I love that April is, on the state agency side of things. I love doing this work because it's like, I get to pretend that I'm state agency for a little bit. State agencies come to me. So in this case, TPWD, Texas Parks and Wildlife Department, came to the lab that I was in and said, hey, we want to do our first CWD hunter perception study. So I got to be involved in that in Texas, and same thing on the Arkansas side of things. Arkansas Game and Fish came to me to help with kind of some of the data set side of things. So it's been fantastic to be involved in that. And I think this is just kind of cool from like seeing what's under the hood, what's in the black box in terms of what agencies are thinking and the information that they're gathering and then trying to use in terms of their management decisions and implications there. And all that, when you get one of these surveys, please take it, because agencies are kind of looking at your data and trying to assess from there, how they should go forward. There we go. This for me. So just kind of two aspects that I wanted to highlight, at least from this kind of portion that I'll be talking about for right now, is that I just kind of wanted to give basically an overview of kind of findings, but then also specifically talk about how those findings are kind of translated into actions, specifically communications, because that's kind of what I do. But again, on that agency side, so a look under the hood a little bit. To quickly kind of run through our methods, this survey from Texas Parks and Wildlife Department did actually go to two different populations of people. It went to hunters, so people that in this case had to reside in Texas and had purchased Texas hunting licenses. And then we further screened to make sure that we were talking to specifically deer hunters. And that could be whitetail deer, mule deer, red deer. We have elk, Sika deer. So kind of running the full gamut in Texas, at least, because all of those are CWD susceptible species. And then we also talked to landowners. And like I mentioned, this is kind of an emerging group in terms of the literature. Most studies don't really focus on landowners. So this was kind of another push to see what's going on that side of things. And in this case, we were specifically looking at people that owned property in CWD impacted counties, which at the time was eight counties, although that has increased since this went out. So just some quick highlights. Basically, we had kind of a split sample, pretty even between hunters and landowners. For the most part, we're looking at males. For the most part, we're looking at, kind of an older crowd. 55 was the mean among hunters and 65 was the mean among landowners. And on the hunter side, most of our sample had hunted within the past year. And many of them were kind of veteran hunters in the sense that they were not novice hunters. These are people that had been hunting for over 10 years. And most people, and generally speaking in Texas, hunt exclusively on private lands. And then some do a little bit more of a split. There are very few people that kind of hunt just on public lands. And on the landowner side, we had a couple people, 26 people with properties in 2 of those counties. Most people just kind of had one property in one county. People generally owned their land for a while in our sample, and about half of our respondents did not generate any income from their land. And among the half that did, livestock and agriculture was kind of the main income driver in those groups. So we already kind of started talking about this, which is great. So looking at CWD testing, we found that 48% of our hunter sample, at least, had hunted in a CWD zone in the past year. At that point, there were a couple different CWD zones spread out throughout the state. And in those CWD zones, it was in fact mandatory to test. Whether or not people actually obeyed that mandatory kind of regulation, that was something that unfortunately I was not allowed to ask about. The agency didn't want to know if people were not obeying that or not. But kind of the takeaway here, at least, is that half of our sample did actually hunt in those CWD zones. And that was among hunters. Our hunter population was from all over the state. So that kind of says a lot. However, looking at looking at testing behaviors outside of the CWD zone, so where it would be voluntary testing, 75% of that group just did not ever get their deer tested, which, as we just kind of talked about, that's a super important aspect. So that's something that immediately TPWD was kind of like, let me, kind of think through that. Yes, in this case, TPWD was the testing agency. However, there were, this is in response to a question in the chat, who is the testing agency? Is there only one? It was TPWD, and they had several testing stations, even within each CWD zone. And if you were not in a CWD zone, one of the things we heard, which I'll get to in a second, is that there were not a whole lot of testing options. They were just kind of far away for people, but there were options out there. Great question. And then, right, a very few kind of the remaining set of people there, the 25% that did at least sometimes get their deer tested, only 3% was kind of in the always, or at least very frequently, side of getting those deer tested all the time. Main reasons why people weren't getting their deer tested: it's not required, right? If it's not mandatory testing, the general idea was, why would I do that? Also kind of up there, CWD is not a concern outside of the CWD zones, and they don't know where to get samples taken. And so just kind of to highlight some of the opportunities that TPWD was then taking from this data, again, trying to kind of look under the hood here, they were like, well, this is great, in terms of improved education and communication about the purpose of testing. So recognizing that it is important outside of CWD zones, very important for your own health when you're in CWD zones, but even outside of those zones, we need that testing to make sure that we can track kind of where the disease is progressing. And then also improved communications about those sampling locations, so that, right, we never really want a circumstance where someone wants to get their deer tested but doesn't know how or where to get that done. So improving communications about that is going to be super important. This was just a quick look at kind of what hunters had identified as ways to improve and making testing. Oh, sorry, Elizabeth. Sorry, I missed it. Is the testing agency a private organization? I don't know, within TPWD, I don't know like where that actually gets taken, like what lab it gets taken to. I've actually been assuming that it was entirely through TPWD, but I don't know beyond that. Sorry, I don't have a better answer to that one.
Hi, sorry to interrupt. There's a lab that WRC sends samples to.
And I'm not sure if they're the only lab, but biologists will collect the samples and then they'll send them in. They'll send all the samples to the lab and then get the results from them.
Out of curiosity, does that happen like en masse, like they send in a whole bunch, or is it just kind of a constant rolling testing process?
I think that before it may have been a little bit more en masse, but now that CWD has been found, they've definitely been rolling them out. I got my results back within about a month of giving my samples to the biologist. So it was a pretty quick turnaround process. If I had been in a CWD zone, I would have wanted to like froze any meat from the deer that harvested and waited. But it was a pretty quick process. But I'm sure that, you know, different states handle it different ways, but I think they're trying to get people the results back as quick as possible, especially with, you know, new cases popping up.
Awesome. Yeah, I know that turnaround time was something that was of concern when I was looking at this stuff, at least in Texas. Some people, when I was pre-testing this, were like, yeah, I'm not gonna wait that long. Like if I harvest a deer, I'm gonna want to basically eat it kind of soon. So that time period was something that kind of sparked potential concern there. But that's good that unfortunately, as cases are more and more frequent, the recognition of we got to turn this stuff around faster. So I guess silver lining there. But thank you, April. Appreciate that. So yeah, just kind of looking at these improvements here. More check stations was kind of the main thing. Again, this is of people that where this was voluntary, so outside of CWD zones. So in this case, making sure that there were more of those locations was a big thing for people, and certainly a barrier to testing participation. And TPWD indicated that that's something that they could potentially work with. So to transition a little bit over to the landowner side of things, not to get too bogged down in this, I really just kind of wanted to highlight a couple main pieces here. First one here is looking at people's perceptions of kind of how they manage deer on their land. And we kind of have, in terms of a scale of 1 to 5, strongly disagree to strongly agree, kind of neutral to positive agreement that they manage deer populations on their land, and depending on that presence of CWD, they might want to kind of manage that differently, manage those populations differently. And great news is that there is kind of a fair amount of agreement here that landowners feel responsible for keeping the deer populations on their land healthy, and they're concerned about the health of deer on their land. So that's great news in terms of trying to kind of gain landowner engagement in things. If we can frame that as, you know, ways to mitigate or deal with threats to deer health, that might be a way to kind of get landowners on board if they feel that sense of responsibility. Senses of responsibility in what I do, that's always a great kind of indicator there, because it means that people care. And when people care, they're generally willing to kind of change their behavior a little bit more. So I mentioned agency trust is a big thing. TPWD, just like any other agency, was really interested in kind of seeing how people thought, you know, they're managing CWD kind of generally, and what people think about their regulations and policies and things. So we looked at kind of on the agency side and also on the regulation side. Generally, we see pretty strong agreement that regulations related to CWD are necessary. And good news is people don't find them overly complicated or strict or burdensome, anything like that. And we're seeing some pretty strong agreement. So again, good news for the agency that TPWD is using the best available science. They're proactive and precautionary. They have the welfare of wildlife in mind. They're transparent, and that the strategies that they've implemented will be effective in preventing CWD, and that their approach is kind of something that people can agree with. So on a kind of communication side, and just from what TPWD was pulling from these results, they're like, this is great. We want to basically keep reinforcing the way that we're going, right? When people have that strong agent or sense of agency trust or trust in the agency, we want to keep that rolling. and continuing to involve stakeholders, right? People appreciated the fact that TPWD was viewed as transparent and kind of creating these approaches that are compatible with respondents' visions. So continuing to move things in that direction and highlight when that's happening, that's really important as well. Some potential areas to address here, looking at sufficient inclusion of hunters versus landowners. We see that hunters agreed with that statement more than landowners. Same thing with inclusion of kind of interests involved, and also defining hunter and landowner expectations. In all of those instances, hunters agreed with those statements more so than landowners. Generally, some kind of lower responses related to the agency having appropriate funding or adequate funding, and being able to secure necessary resources. And then also some kind of interesting results related to pursuing eradication. As I'll mention, we have a lot of agreement with that, which is great, but actually managing that as an expectation might be challenging on the agency side if people think that this is something that we can just eradicate and kind of deal with super quickly. And focusing on just kind of another cool piece here, focusing on that reduction of deer populations via hunter harvest only versus hunter harvest and alternative methods. Again, thinking about sharpshooters there, we are actually seeing some agreement with that, which is different than a lot of other literature that indicated that people were not super into the idea of bringing in sharpshooters. So again, kind of areas to potentially improve here if you're TPWD, increasing that landowner inclusion in decision-making and highlighting when it occurs. So the tough part about what I do is these are just perceptions, right? This does not mean necessarily that TPWD doesn't do a good job with this. It means that people perceive TPWD doesn't maybe do a good job with it. So in these instances, you know, if we kind of come back to TPWD and they're like, oh, you know, we think we do a good job with this. And maybe they're like, we don't do such a great job. Great game plan kind of moving forward. But it also could just be people are perceiving that difference there. And so when there are events that are including landowners, really highlighting those on social media, other communication channels, that can help with that perception. So perceptions are always hard. It's what people are thinking, not necessarily the reality. But a lot of times for this kind of government trust and agency trust stuff, it's the perception that really matters. So it gets a little hard. Also, I kind of mentioned perhaps some communication might be necessary to manage expectations around potentially eradicating CWD and how that's likely not so much an option, at least in the short term. And then having good news is having some having some support for reducing populations, even through alternative methods. Like I mentioned, that's something that in a lot of other states has not garnered a whole lot of support. So the fact that that's present in Texas, it's just another tool in the toolbox for TPWD to potentially fall on. Related to kind of individual actions, because right, a lot of the stuff that I just talked about is stuff that TPWD can do, whether it's regulatory or kind of decision-making that's occurring. Thinking about the individual side of things and trying to get people to engage in individual actions. Generally, we saw that hunters and landowners agreed that they would be willing to report sick-looking deer, which is great, just in terms of being aware of how the disease might be progressing through the landscape, supporting businesses that assist with controlling CWD and abiding by different response plans and kind of reporting roadkill. And hunters kind of largely agreed that they'd be willing to continue harvesting deer in CWD zones, which again, thinking about managing populations is really important. It would be very problematic if a large segment of the hunting population said, well, once CWD is in an area, we don't want to hunt there anymore. That's a problem. They'd also agree that they're willing to comply with current rules related to having deer tested within CWD zones. And they would also actually, like April mentioned, refrain from transporting those whole deer carcasses outside of the county, right, to limit that, that potential transfer of the disease. So all good news there. In terms of kind of an opportunity here, clearly there's a willingness, which is great. The next step is communicating how to do those things. So again, kind of looking at willingness to engage in these different individual actions and kind of the motivations behind that, which is always helpful because again, if we're interested in, we have the willingness, but we're interested in trying to understand how we can kind of garner that engagement and kind of what we need to say to get people engaged. we have kind of a map of that here. The big thing here is people wanting to prevent the transfer of CWD to other deer. Again, we saw that people were clearly concerned about deer population health. So this is a way of kind of getting at that. Also with the recognition that CWD is a serious disease that impacts deer is certainly up there, as well as people trusting that these actions actually help prevent the spread of CWD. So the idea is that using kind of the slide before, thinking about those individual actions, if you can use this kind of messaging to get people to engage in those actions, that's clearly, this is clearly some messaging and ideas that people, that resonate with people. Among groups that were kind of not willing to engage in those individual actions, basically we're seeing that, I mean, for the most part, these are generally low, but making sure that people do know how to engage in those actions is really important. Kind of the highest one here was just, there wasn't enough information about provided about those actions. So if we can deal with that, and if we can provide more information, that might be a way to get some of these people more on board and more willing to participate and engage in those actions. TPWD, it was pretty cool. They were very interested in different incentive options that they could kind of throw at people to see how they could get people to engage in these types of behaviors. On the hunter side, the idea that hunters could receive replacement tags for any CWD positive deer that were harvested, that was a big potential incentive there, as well as entry into different kind of lifetime hunting and fishing license raffles, and entry into the big time Texas hunt draw for deer that are harvested and tested. That's just kind of a cool, those raffles are great on the agency side because, right, it's a raffle, so you don't have to promise everyone a thing or promise everyone, you know, a license. It's just like you're thrown into this draw and you only have to part with a couple hunting licenses or whatever it is. Question about Texas prohibiting baiting and feeding, and then also another question of when and where was the first uptick in CWD noticed? What year? It goes way back. I have to double check on the year exactly. Certainly in the early 2000s, it was around, might go back to the 80s, 90s, to be perfectly honest. Texas prohibiting baiting and feeding. I don't think so at this point, but let me, in my brain, I have Arkansas and Texas. And so I know in some places that's the case and not others, but I can double check that. And how do they do the replacement? It takes a long time. I know that much, right? You have to wait until those test results come back and then you get the replacement tag. Does anyone have more information on the baiting versus feeding? I don't have that off the top of my head, but that should be, we'll put Genevieve on that. Yeah. Who do we have?
So I don't know about Texas in specific. I know that plenty of states have restricted the use of baiting and feeding because then you're congregating deer more than they naturally would be. And so they're all eating out of the same corn pile, putting their saliva into the mix, and then they can transmit it through their saliva. So the fact that they're eating together is a pretty big risk for spreading CWD. And in some areas, I mean, you can use food plots, you know, stuff like that to increase the chances of maybe harvesting a deer while also lessening the risk of transmitting it through a bait pile. So it's just trying to reduce that risk of transmission. And I believe the first case of CWD was in Colorado in the 1970s. But I could be mistaken. But I mean, it's spread a lot since then. It was originally confined to like Colorado and then Wyoming and such. But now it's moved across the United States, you know, potentially due to populations, the deer moving around and contacting each other, through hunters moving it, and also through through the captive cervid, through captive cervid populations, where, you know, they move it to the area and it stays in the soil, basically forever, and then, you know, lost for the person who was farming cervids and horrible for the state.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know from that cervid farming side of things, I think the first case here in the States actually was found in a captive facility that may have been in Texas, I mean in Canada, and I may have flipped those, but within the first kind of the first couple cases there were on the captive side. And that's what, yeah, in terms of congregating animals, when you think of kind of the worst thing that you can do, those captive facilities are rough for that CWD spread and prevalence. And actually, that's a great segue. Well, I can wrap up with kind of this aspect here, but the captive deer breeding side I find really fascinating. And as far as I know, most studies have not looked at kind of perceptions related to that captive deer breeding side of things. And that was what was kind of cool about this survey that I did with TPWD. I'm pretty sure it's the first time that we kind of looked at perceptions related to that captive deer breeding side. So it's definitely an interesting wrinkle in all of this as well. Question. So where are the infected CWD bodies disposed of? If prions can't be eliminated, are the bodies being disposed of properly? I don't think, I mean, there's kind of the proper way to dispose of them, but I don't think that it actually does anything to necessarily, it's definitely not in terms of like, well, this is no longer contaminated. If that, I think, is kind of what you're getting at with that question. It's definitely not like, okay, I've properly disposed of this, now we don't have to worry about it.
Typically, biologists will try to, I think now, you either incinerate the carcass, or you ensure that it's buried, like for landowners and such, you can bury the carcass, just make sure nothing else is getting in with it. But I know they're trying to increase testing here in North Carolina. So you're going to have incinerators that should hopefully kill the prions. They can be killed at really high temperatures, like really high. So they are using those. Typically, you make sure to dispose of it.
Okay, yeah, I'm asking because it was my understanding that they are well, you can't dispose of them. Heat does not kill them. So if you're burying that in the land, you're basically going to eventually contaminate underground water.
Yeah, that's definitely a concern. Yeah, you just burying it won't get rid of it, but it's there, you can get rid of it sometimes in landfills, though that's typically, I would imagine, for roadkill deer that you don't believe would be a case of CWD. But yeah, unfortunately, the best case scenario is to leave it in the area that it was harvested, or to incinerate it. But the State Wildlife Agency, they would be in charge getting rid of it, but they do try to ensure that they are disposing of any carcasses really, so that it's not being transmitted.
Yeah, that's what worries me, is the state agencies being involved. But that's another topic. Okay, thanks.
Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah, and great questions. There's definitely, I mean, and that's what makes a lot of this stuff difficult, is that there are so many unknowns still.
Yeah.
Even though CWD has been around for a long time at this point, there's still, and I think that's true with prion research in general, is that there's just not a great understanding of kind of how this stuff works. So it's why, we have on the agency side kind of relaying some communications related to human health and things like that, even though, yeah, we don't have necessarily kind of data to back up that transmission aspect. So it's trying to be as conservative as possible with a lot of this stuff. And so actually, right, we had talked about the reporting of CWD and how that can take a while. So if that were to be turned around pretty quickly, that was a big incentive for landowners in terms of getting them to engage in individual actions, that free and convenient access to donate harvested deer, and then also extending whitetail deer season through the end of February. That was kind of a big draw for people. And what's cool about these actions, these are all actions and kind of incentives that TPWD actually would be willing to put on the table. So it was kind of cool to see these responses in there to, you know, these were not just like made up by research. It was like TPWD put some thought to this and said, you know, that these are things that we can actually do. And so just to kind of link to communications things as kind of the last piece that I'll do here, just because we blew through our time together. 25% of all the respondents that we looked at had not actually received any communications about CWD, and landowners were actually likely to have not received, or were more likely to have not received any information, which is, you know, a little concerning on TPWD's side of things. The most common sources among people that had seen communications related to CWD were TPWD's news site, which is pretty consistent across states in that those agency web pages are big drivers of traffic. Newspaper articles, just doing it old school, and then word of mouth through friends and family is another big one. And here were just kind of some other topics that people were interested in hearing more about. Certainly what symptoms of CWD kind of look like and how to look for those in sick looking animals, as well as what they can do to prevent the spread of CWD, which is great news if you're the agency and people are interested in that kind of information. So capitalizing on these types of topics with new communication strategies is kind of a direction that TPWD is looking for or looking towards. And then preferred communication methods. Basically, we can run statistically ways of kind of looking at among different demographics of people, what are the best ways to communicate with them? So basically trying to target messaging towards certain groups of people is important. So if, you know, younger hunters are more interested in hearing this kind of information about CWD, we can then target, you know, Instagram posts that have a younger audience with that type of information versus maybe a mailed newsletter of, you know, something in the newspaper geared towards an older audience or geared more towards landowners. And that has information that is more geared towards that audience as well. So again, that's pretty much everything that I had time to run through tonight. I didn't even get to my captive deer breeding stuff, but if you're interested in that, shoot me an email. I'd be happy to chat about it sometime. Genevieve just put my contact information in the chat if anyone's interested. And actually I can kind of jump to that here as well, just so that you all have it. There we go. So that has my email information as well as Twitter. If you guys do Twitter, you can give me a follow, and I kind of try to post about this stuff as well. But thank you all for kind of joining in with me, asking awesome questions. It was fun because we had a discussion, at least for me. I hope you guys had a good time. And again, happy to chat more about this stuff to whoever's interested.